And like every Thursday, we remind you about the books. I know we insist a lot on this, but it's really a very important support for Gonzalo's talks. And the books, they allow us to delve even deeper into all this, into this new paradigm that Gonzalo is presenting to us in this series of talks. We have the book, A New Paradigm of Reality, the book Espiritualizarse. We remind you that in the previous session, it was session number 7 that focused on self-responsibility or victimhood, on that important choice we can make at every moment. And today we are going to listen to session number 8, which is about thought management to achieve peace. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Gonzalo.
Well, thank you very much, Juan. Indeed, as you said, today we are going to talk about managing thoughts, right? How can we manage our thoughts to have more peace, right? So if you all agree, the first thing we're going to do is something very simple, which is to define what a thought is, right? Because we all talk about thoughts and we all know we experience the effect, but a thought is it's a wave of variable dimension, okay? That is a thought. Notice that it is a wave just like light waves or like sound waves, right? But it has one difference or two differences with these other waves we know, like radio waves, light waves, or let's say sound waves, right? And the two differences are these, aren't they? Thought is a wave of variable dimension. So just as sound waves and light waves propagate in the third dimension, right? With thought, we can go to other dimensions, right? That's the first difference. And the second difference is that thought propagates at infinite speed. It is not limited to the speed of light, right? Like sound waves, which are limited to a slower speed, or light waves, which are limited by the speed of light, correct? If I, for example, think of the Andromeda galaxy, well, I am there immediately. I don't know if I'm making myself clear or not. And as always, they are made of energy plus information, informed energy. In that sense, we can say that thoughts are things, like this table, right? In fact, I have a book at home written by a scientist titled Thoughts Are Things. Simply that since they vibrate faster than a table, we cannot perceive them with our senses. And we can only assert that thoughts exist because we experience their effects, right? This can also serve as an argument for explaining to others the presence of God, right? For example, if I ask a dog if thoughts exist, it will say no, because it doesn't smell them, doesn't touch them, doesn't hear them, and furthermore, doesn't experience the effects, right? Of course, when entering mystic consciousness, one experiences the effect of the presence of God in the same way that the consciousness of the self experiences the effect of thought, right? And that is something we have to keep in mind as an argument for those who cannot want to deny that, right? So notice, in the first session of this course, we had talked about the change of context, right? The first thing we have to do to manage thought well is to change mental context, to replace the materialistic context, right? In which we have unknowingly created, that has raised us all, right? Because it was the predominant culture, regardless of how much religious faith one had, right? Changing the context to a more spiritual one is the first step, right? To properly manage thought, to facilitate inner peace, isn't it? Let's see, the second thing I'd like to say, and I will try to go slower today,
because sometimes, since there's a lot of information to convey, we are going too fast, aren't we? Let's see. We have to try to train ourselves, right? So that we always have voluntary, sustained, and directed thoughts in our mind, right? Right? That we don't let our thoughts guide us, but that we guide our thoughts, right? That we don't let thoughts be automatic, right? The mind is always active, and you, if you observe yourselves, will be able to verify. We usually have about 3 types of thoughts, right? On one hand, we have thoughts that I call captured. Captured meaning we're driving a car, for example, we're distracted, and our mind is thinking about things our mind is capturing. We will see how the brain is a receiver of thought, not a sender of thought. So we pick up thoughts as we drive along. And the type of thoughts we tend to pick up when we are distracted are thoughts that are closely related to our level of consciousness. Of course, if Mother Teresa is driving a car and is distracted, she will pick up very different thoughts. If Al Capone or Pablo Escobar is driving a car, they're going to pick up thoughts of lower vibration, right? But in addition to the thoughts that, so to speak, we capture, right? We also have voluntarily originated thoughts. I mean, there are times when we sit down to work and we say, well, I'm going to start thinking about this book or this activity I'm doing or whatever. That is not a captured thought, right? Rather, it's a consciously originated thought, right? But we have a third type of thought. And I want you to pay attention to this last one because sometimes we aren't as aware of it, which I call planted thoughts. Okay? What is a planted thought? Well, for example, when angels, right? Well, they want to plant a thought in us so that we have an event or a circumstance for growth or understanding, right? And so it's good to be aware, right, of the type of thoughts we are having to manage them better, isn't it? So, of course, it's not the same a thought that we voluntarily direct when the thought is simply captured, right? We're driving and with that thought can be positive, negative, anything, right? But the planted thought usually leaves us with a feeling of peace and security, right? For example, the higher beings who assist us in our growth, of course, find it much easier to come down to the 5th dimension and plant a thought in us than to come down to the 3rd dimension and present themselves physically and say something to us, right? Therefore, it is good that we are attentive, right, to what thoughts can be planted, right? Because those, just like the captured ones, we normally need to set aside. The planted ones we need to attend to. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, right? And it is with introspection, by being aware of these 3 possibilities of thought that we have, it can help us distinguish those planted thoughts that are so valuable, right? Of course, they were not voluntarily originated by us, but neither were they randomly picked up, right? And that's something we need to look at, right? And that takes practice, of course, right? But the day we can know if the thought we're having is simply picked up at random, or if it is voluntarily originated or planted, well, that will go a long way to help us to manage thought. And of course, the difference between those captured randomly and distractedly, or those voluntarily originated, is very clear to everyone, but it's usually not so clear that thoughts are planted in us and how to distinguish them, right? And that's what we have to work on, right? So to speak, right? Okay. Another thing we must be clear about in this management of thought is that there are many wise people and many mystics, more than one, who have always said that the quality of our life will be the quality of our thoughts, right? And that's why it's so important to learn to manage ourselves, to manage our thoughts, and not let negative circular thoughts take root in our minds, right? Because as we discussed in the first sessions, causation in the universe is downward. Therefore, thoughts modify the chemistry of our brain and change our neural connections, right? Notice that it was previously thought that depression was more like an illness, such as a flu or like hepatitis, wasn't it? But now we know that depression is more like a drop in energy, right? That is when we allow circular negative thoughts, obsessive thoughts nest in our minds, because we do not voluntarily direct them. Those thoughts change the brain chemistry and alter the circuits, right, that we use. And therefore, well, that doesn't mean that when the chemistry is messed up, it's not advisable to take a pill to help us. But fundamentally, we will heal all depressions and all situations of anxiety and worry by learning to use thoughts of love, spiritual understanding, and high vibration, which themselves alter our chemistry, either to worsen it or to improve it. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, right? Hence the importance of knowing how to think correctly and knowing how to manage thought, right? Okay. Another thing we need to be clear about, right, on the topic of thought, is that for a thought to be correct, it must produce a feeling of inner peace, right? If the thought does not give us inner peace, the thought is incorrect, no matter how much we have respected its logical correctness. That is to say, a philosopher might tell you a correct thought is a thought that follows good logic. But I tell you, no, a correct thought, of course, must follow good logic, because that is a sine qua non condition, but it is not a sufficient condition, right? For the thought to be correct, besides following good logic, it has to leave us with an internal sensation as a byproduct of inner peace, okay? I'm going to try to give an example of this, which is a very important idea, isn't it? On one occasion, a gentleman came to see me in Miami who was a businessman, quite successful, an educated man, but he was divorced. And according to him, I don't know her, he had a complicated wife. He was a foreigner, not American, although he lived in the United States, and he had a 14-year-old son. And the woman had forbidden, or there was a court ruling, right? And the judge, well, had ruled that did not allow the son to travel out of the country with the father. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, right? Of course, the father came to see me very desperate, very bitter, saying, how is this possible? My 14-year-old son cannot travel with me. He cannot see the world. He cannot meet my family. I'm feeling awful, you know. And I told him, look, my son, I understand you perfectly, but you have to understand that you're feeling bad because you're not thinking right. As we all know, feeling is a byproduct of thought, right? And therefore, if we don't think well, we don't feel well, okay? So, and he says to me, but Gonzalo, don't you think it's logical that it would be better if my son could travel, could meet my family who lives abroad, could see the world? And I remember I told him, look, son, I'm not saying you're not thinking logically, but what I'm telling you is that even though you are thinking logically, you are not thinking well because you lack inner peace. That's why you came to see me. And then I told him, look, to have inner peace, you need to add a tag to that logically well-constructed thought. And he says, what tag? And I say, well, look, you might think, man, it would be great if my son could travel, see the world and such. But if this is not happening, it is because it is perfect and necessary for the evolution of souls in some way, right? Maybe it turns out that the universe knows that if your son boards a plane to go see your family in Asia, right, the plane will crash and he will die. Or maybe it knows something will happen to him in that country. Or maybe the universe creates this event so that you learn to think properly, right? But whatever it is, if it's happening, it shouldn't take away your peace, because it is perfect and necessary for the evolution of souls, or it wouldn't happen. The universe doesn't make mistakes. I told him more. I said, also, if you are able to return to your home, accept what is happening, forgive your ex-wife, understand that she is doing the best she can and knows even if she makes mistakes. You send her love and light every night and wish her the best. Probably the universe will fix this situation because it has nothing more to teach you. I remember that 2 weeks later, he calls me and says, Gonzalo, I say, what? You won't believe it. I say, what won't I believe? He says, well, you don't know what happened. That's when I say, what happened? He says, well, look, I followed your advice. I got home, accepted the situation, forgave my ex-wife, sent her light, love, wished her the best. I already realized that my son, well, when he is 17 years old, there will be no one stopping him from traveling because he is already an adult. It's just a matter of waiting a bit, and I was at peace. And do you know what happened? Without hiring a lawyer, without filing an appeal, I received a call from the court saying that the judge, after reviewing the case files on their own initiative, decided to change the order. This is a real case that happened to me, right? For example, imagine we meet with a friend because we have a problem and want to consult him about it. And the friend says, yes, he would be happy to. And we agree to meet in a cafe at 4 in the afternoon, okay? And we get there and the friend doesn't show up and doesn't show up and doesn't show up. Of course, our mind can go in two directions, right? It can think, this friend of mine is stupid, an idiot, doesn't care about me at all, doesn't respect my time, is irresponsible, okay? And if we think like that, how are we going to feel? Surely bad, right? Now we're faced with the same fact that the friend doesn't show up. We think differently that, hey, this person has shown me for a long time that they are serious, responsible, that they care about me. Maybe something has happened to them. They've had a car accident, they couldn't even call me. They might have even had a heart attack. Well, I'll find out tonight or tomorrow and we'll see. Surely if we think the second way, right, we will feel better than if we think in the first way, even though the fact is the same, which is that the friend has not shown up. Then how we feel depends on how we think, right, about the situation. And learning to think well about things will be a great source of peace for us. But let's go. The important message here is, please do not think that just because something is logical, the thought is already correct. The thought is only correct if we think logically and if we are left with an internal feeling of peace. And if not, it's not correct, no matter how logical it may seem, okay? We have to understand that, as we said in the first session, the universe is multidimensional, right? So everything physical, everything material is in the third dimension. Thoughts, they go from the fourth dimension to the ninth. And above the ninth dimension are the dimensions of consciousness, okay? So many times we have negative thoughts, right? Of hatred, of resentment, of sadness, of sorrow, or whatever. Those thoughts are heavier, meaning their vibrational frequency is lower, and that is why they leave us with an internal feeling of lack of peace and unease. Then we have thoughts that I would call practical, right? For example, I'm going out for dinner, what should I wear? Or I pick some red pants or black or green or what. Those thoughts which are, let's say, practical, usually don't leave us with a very negative or very positive feeling. They are simply practical, right? And they are fifth dimensional thoughts. But the thoughts that range from the sixth to the ninth, which are thoughts of love, generosity, harmony, unity, spiritual understanding, all those thoughts, they always leave us a very pleasant internal feeling, right? And they also increase the vibration of the mind, right? And we have to learn not to let those lower dimensional, heavier thoughts take root in our mind for a long time. Because as we said before, and it is important to repeat, they will change the brain's chemistry, they will change the neural connections, and they will facilitate and make it easier for other negative thoughts to come back, you know, and keep bothering us. And because of this, we can end up with a massive drop in energy. Whereas if we try voluntarily, right, having sustained positive and voluntary thoughts will increase the brain's vibration, change our chemistry and neural connections. And it will make it easier for us to have more thoughts like that in the future. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, right? It's like we create a mental habit. Okay, fine. So up to this point, those are the small ideas, right? Another idea I'd like to leave with you in this session, you know, it's just that we have to be careful with all these new age books that are coming out now, right? Saying that we can change reality with our thoughts, that if we focus enough on this glass of water, we can turn it into wine and so on, right? Let's see. That is not true. Don't let yourselves be confused by this, okay? Thought, as it goes from the vibration of the, from the fourth to the ninth dimension, still does not have enough strength to change matter directly, right? It is consciousness that changes matter, isn't it? The one that collapses the wave function of the electron, okay? Now then, human beings achieve our spiritual growth in our mental field. That's why God has given us a neocortex, which animals do not have, right? And a capacity for reasoning. We first make spiritual comprehensions mentally, and then they are recorded in that consciousness file that is linked to the soul. They remain recorded there unless we can sufficiently develop contemplation to be able to receive information through direct intuition and not through the sequential process, but usually and at low, medium, or medium-high levels of consciousness. So spiritual growth takes place in the mental field, okay? It's true that thought can indirectly change our reality, but it changes our reality because by understanding spiritual truths, we no longer need growth events. In other words, our thinking can prevent us from experiencing growth events, but it cannot change reality. Reality for us will always follow the laws we talked about the other day. It is created by consciousness. What happens is that consciousness is efficient, and if we do not need a lesson, it will not place the event in front of us to avoid wasting events or energy. Therefore, we can only indirectly change our reality with our thoughts, changing our learning needs, right? But you can visualize the wine in this glass all you want, and it's not going to happen, right? The reason Jesus could change water into wine is because he connected directly with consciousness, not because he could do it with ordinary thought. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, right? And this is important because otherwise there will be many frustrated people trying to visualize a red Ferrari in the garage, as I say, and it will not appear, right? Fine. Another important thing in this matter of thought is to clearly understand how the relationship between the brain, the mind, and consciousness works, because there is also a lot of confusion here, right? Let's see. The brain is an organ that exists in the third dimension, okay? A neurosurgeon can open our skull and we can see the brain, but we will never be able to see thoughts because thoughts are in other dimensions that are not visible due to their vibrational speed. So the first thing we need to understand is that consciousness is a holon of greater depth than the mind, and the mind is a holon of greater depth than the brain. That is, evolutionarily, the mind is more significant than the brain, and consciousness is more significant than the mind. But the brain is more fundamental than the mind, because if I destroy my brain, I can no longer experience the mind, right? We must not confuse the anchor, which is the brain, with what is significant, which is the mind and consciousness. And I tell you this because I have seen many books by scientists, even philosophers, that say things like consciousness is a byproduct of the mind. That is not true. The mind is one of the possibilities of consciousness, as is intuition, as is instinct, as is emotion, and as are feelings. But both instinct, emotion, feelings, the mind, all of that is part of consciousness, and they are depths of consciousness, right? Therefore, consciousness encompasses everything. The mind is one of the possibilities of consciousness, and the brain is the physical organ that consciousness creates so that we can experience the mind. That's something we need to understand well, I think, in order to manage it well, right? And we have to realize that the brain does not produce thought or consciousness, but rather captures it. I compare the brain to a radio transistor because the radio transistor does not produce radio programs. Those are produced in a recording studio somewhere. They broadcast them, send out the waves, and what the radio transistor allows me to do is capture them. Notice also that in a radio transistor, if I change the frequency, right, turn the dial, I can capture some waves or others, okay? So the brain works like a radio transistor. It does not produce the programs, but it picks them up, right? If the brain produced thought or consciousness, then we would have to talk about upward causation. But although this has been assumed like this by many people, they have never been able to produce any proof of how that happens or how matter, right? The brain, which is matter, can produce consciousness. It is much easier to understand that it is consciousness that produces matter, right? If I am explaining myself right, and therefore let's not fall into the scientific reductionism of thinking that the brain produces thought or consciousness. No, the brain captures thought or consciousness. Of course, just like computers, there are computers with more memory capacity, with more processing capacity, etc., right? There are also brains that have more memory capacity than others, more processing capacity genetically, but that doesn't mean they produce, rather they capture more possibilities, so to speak, right? And notice, besides, that the computer is not free. The one who is free is the user of the computer. The computer responds to the instructions I give it, right? So the same happens with the brain and the mind, right? It is the soul that has the direction of the matter, right? But the brain itself has no freedom. The brain is a processor, just like a computer, right? Understanding it this way, I think it will be easier for us to manage our mind than if we don't understand it this way. And that doesn't negate the fact that if someone hits my brain with a hammer, I will stop perceiving the mind, because the significant has to have its anchorage in the fundamental, right? But it does mean that internally we can, from our soul, we can direct the mind. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, and decide which thoughts we want to have or not have, or we will allow, right? And that will change the quality of our life, because it will change the type of feelings we have. Okay, good. Some authors say that even the neocortex, okay, is divided into lower mind and higher mind, right? And that, of course, because we all know that the mind has many voices, right? Many times we have many voices in the mind of all kinds, right? And the question is, which one of them is going to win, right? And remember the spiritual story, right? In this sense, it says that the one that we feed more will win, right? We have like two dogs in the mind, one good and one bad. Which one will win? The disciple asks the master, and the master replies, well, my son, the one you feed the most, but come on, don't get disheartened or depressed, because it seems like we always have conflicting thoughts in our mind, and two dogs, one good and one bad and such, because that is the nature of the mind. right? And what we have to start learning is to nurture that which gives us good feelings and increases our spiritual understanding. It is an exercise of will to say, I am not going to let these negative thoughts nest in my mind because they are going to kill me. I always say that the mind is not me. Just like emotions are not me, I am my soul. I have a mind and emotions, but they are not me. And I like to think of the mind as the broom I have at home, stored in the kitchen closet. So when I have to sweep, I take the broom and sweep. You know what I mean? But when I'm done sweeping, the broom is no longer useful to me and I put it back in the cupboard. Do I make myself clear? So let's not continue that incessant, do I make myself clear? Turning the mind around, which happens to all of us, right? It happened to me a lot, especially when I was young and traveled so much from the United States to Europe and to Asia and so on for my jobs and my businesses, you know what? And I was always in a permanent jet lag. And when I got into bed at night and couldn't fall asleep, that was when there was no way to control it, right? All the worries come rushing in, everything, But when you notice that your thoughts start racing, a quick exercise that helps a lot is simply focusing on your breathing for a minute. We breathe, we calm down, breathe with the stomach, with the belly, and that tends to calm the mind. And another possibility is to direct the mind to higher dimensions, as we will talk about now, right? All right. So, to better manage the mind and stop it from bothering us so much, I'm going to suggest 3 techniques in quotes, right? I don't like the word technique, but I use it because others do, don't I? Look, the first technique is that we need to learn to dematerialize the thought. If we examine ourselves, right, and we are honest and realize, we will see that almost always our thought is focused on something material and also on something external to us. We are thinking about the next trip we have to take, the meeting, what clothes we will wear, what food we will prepare, and so on. And how much time or what percentage of our thoughts are directed towards the spiritual world, to spiritual realities, to higher dimensions, to the fact that we are children of God, or rather to the spiritual world. What percentage of time do we direct our thoughts, and what percentage of the time do we direct our thoughts to the material world? If you conduct this personal examination, you will be surprised. And how surprised I was. And then I make an effort that, for example, when I have nothing to do in the world, I consciously direct my thoughts towards spiritual reality and not always be immersed in materiality. I'm not sure if I make myself clear. So that is an exercise we can do. The second exercise we can do is to try to depolarize our thoughts, right? Because the mind is dualistic, right? And the mind always functions or acts in terms of and or, see, light, darkness, good or bad, cold or heat. But you'll see, darkness doesn't exist, only the absence of light. Evil doesn't exist. God did not create evil. There is the absence of good, which is something else, or ignorance, but we call that evil. See, the mind polarizes. Cold does not exist. There is heat or the absence of heat, but we call the absence of heat cold. So the new paradigm of reality, in many cases, thinks not in terms of and or, but in terms of and. And for example, how much discussion has there been in the world about gods? If God is personal or impersonal. It had to be one or the other because it seems the mind doesn't let you see that it is both at the same time. But the truth is, since God is everything, right? Well, God is personal and impersonal at the same time. Am I clear? And a dualistic mind cannot understand that. That is why we have to depolarize the mind to have less inner conflict, right? And another technique we can use, which will help us with thought management, is to get used to being witnesses to our thoughts, not subject of the thoughts. Okay? Many times, if we don't realize it, we become subjects of emotion, of feeling, of thought, as if it takes over us and we identify with it. But the truth is that we all have the ability to position ourselves as witnesses to all of it, not as subjects. I often tell myself, wow, Gonzalo, you're thinking nonsense as always. I explain myself, I position myself as a witness to my own feelings, my thoughts. I don't let myself become a subject of them, right? And that's something that needs to be practiced. See it, you place yourself in the soul, because of course, to witness something, you have to separate yourself a little from that something, right? And therefore, to separate yourself from that something, you situate yourself in the soul and become a witness to all your lower bodies, including the mental body. You are not your mind. You are not your emotions. You are not your ego. You are your soul. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, right? And every time we can act more from there, we will manage thought better. Because if I make myself the subject of thought, it takes over me, I am lost. Now, if I become a witness, I can see, oh, Gonzalo, you're thinking nonsense. And that already kind of frees you, releases you, you know what I mean, right? So practicing being witnesses of our own thoughts is something that will help us in this regard, right? All right. Another thing we need to keep in mind, while we are on the topic of thinking, especially when we get a bit older, it's good to learn that from time to time, we need to change the polarity of our thoughts, okay? As I said before, almost always without realizing it, we have the mind focused outward unless we make a conscious effort to change the mind's polarity and let it look inward, right? Because if we do not introspect, if we do not examine ourselves, we will grow less, right? If the mind is always distracted by external things, our spiritual growth will be slower. But on the other hand, if from time to time we make the effort to change the polarity of the mind and focus it inward, our spiritual growth will become faster, right? So that's another piece of advice I can offer you that will help you better manage the mind and make our spiritual growth more efficient, okay? Let's see. Here's another idea I'll throw out there. And I know it's a lot of ideas, but thank God this is recorded. So if you can't catch them all or they don't all stick, we can always listen again with a pencil and paper and go to what interests us most, right? But another thing we must learn to accept with peace is the limitation of the mind. The mind is limited. I mean, the mind can do what it can do and cannot do what it cannot do, what it was not created to do. For example, the mind cannot see essence. That is reserved for contemplation or intuition, right? Which is the same. The mind can only see appearance. If it is a very sophisticated mind, then there can be a very sophisticated appearance, but there will never be essence. And therefore, do not get frustrated when that cannot happen, right? It's like, of course, I can't expect instinct to allow me to play chess. I mean, that instinct is not made for that, right? So the mind is not made to see essence. Therefore, if we want to see essence, we have to develop the contemplative capacity or intuition, right? What problems do we humans sometimes have in developing intuition? Or at least those like me, right? Very rational, very business-minded, very much this or that. Well, we always know when we are thinking, right? Because it's a sequential process. A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, and it also consumes energy. Therefore, when we study a topic, every 2 hours, we need to get up, rest our mind a bit, and then return. This means it consumes energy and tires us. But intuition is not sequential. It is an apprehension with axioms direct from the information. In that sense, it is very similar to instinct. Instinct is also direct. They put a plate of food in front of you and you immediately like it or don't like it, you don't have to reason it. Or they put a person of the opposite sex in front of you and immediately they're attractive to you or not. You don't have to reason it, right? That is, the instinct is direct, right? And intuition is as direct as instinct. And that is why sometimes those of us who tend to be rational, we find it hard to accept intuition because by confusing it with instinct, of course, our parents have taught us in education to live from reason, not from instinct. Because of course, if we lived from instinct, we'd weigh 400 kilos, have 1,000 partners. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, right? So no, we act from the mind, right? So used to passing instinct through the mind to validate it somehow, we can make the mistake of passing intuition through the mind to validate it too, right? And that took me many years of practice and such to learn to distinguish instinct from intuition. Because you have to regulate instinct, but you can't ruin intuition. I don't know if I make myself clear, right? And if you run it through the mind, you ruin it, right? And after a long time, a great spiritual teacher gave me a solution that worked for me and that I offer you in case it works for you, right? Instinct never gives you peace. You have to respect it and let yourselves be guided by it. But when you have an instinct, you must run it through reason so as not to act like animals. And the distinction between instinct and intuition has that difficulty. And the only way that I have managed, right, to be able to distinguish one from the other is by the internal feeling it leaves me, right? Because if not, both appear directly, right? Well, now, developing intuition is extremely important because it is much more powerful. For example, angels only work with intuition. Not having ego and not having a physical brain, they do not use either instinct or reason, right? They use only intuition. So as we rise spiritually or ascend in levels of consciousness, we will become more intuitive and less instinctive. And that's why you have to know how to distinguish intuition and trust it, right? Let's see. Another important thing, the mind works through beliefs, right? But a belief is not an experience, right? And therefore, the transformative power of belief is much less the transformative power of experience. For example, recently I was listening to a talk by Pablo, which I recommend to you, by Pablo Dos, who about some religion teachers, right? And this point was explained very well, wasn't it? Saying, look, up until 50 years ago, religion wanted belief to be correct. But now people are looking for experience, not just belief, right? And therefore, experience has much greater transformative power than belief, right? Because also beliefs can sometimes be false. While experience is always true, I don't know if I'm making myself clear, right? Therefore, never have beliefs that do not bear good fruit for you, because that is the measuring stick that Jesus set for us in the gospel, right? When the disciples asked him, right? Many times they try to instill beliefs in our heads, right? That when you think about them, you say, but if this is not giving me peace, this is horrible. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. Well then, if that's the case, it is not true. Do I make myself clear? Therefore, for example, if someone asks me tomorrow, Gonzalo, do you believe the moon is round? I say, no, I don't believe the moon is round. I know the moon is round because I have seen a photo. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, right? That's why I really like trusting the mystics, because philosophers or theologians can have many beliefs and can have many mental constructions. But if there is no experience, there is no verification. Do I make myself clear? So I encourage you to listen to this talk by Pablo if you haven't already, right? To these religion teachers, and to develop your capacity for experience, your ability to verify, if you know what I mean, all right? Notice that verification always leads to peace, while belief sometimes does and sometimes doesn't. It depends on whether it is true or not, right? But you will know this through your internal feeling, okay? Don't rely on thinkers. Your internal feeling is the measuring stick in this case, right? All right, lastly, I want to say that, let's say, we can use spiritual understanding as the best psychoanalysis technique, right? All of us have subconscious traumas that we are not aware of and that stimulate our reptilian brain, right? Which is the reactive one, because you know that the brain has 3 layers, right? First, there's the reptilian brain, which we share with crocodiles, okay? And it's the first one that developed, which is the brain for flight, defense, and so on. There's nothing more there, but that brain is faster and more powerful than the other 2. Therefore, the neocortex must be highly developed in order to inhibit the reptilian brain. Because if it doesn't take control quickly, we don't have time, right, to use the other one. Then we have the second layer of the brain, which is called the mesencephalon, where we experience emotions and regulate emotions, because of course, often we have many types of emotions together, and it is the mesencephalon that regulates them. And then we have the neocortex, which is the third layer of the brain, the one that animals don't have developed, which allows us abstract reasoning, right? So we have 3 layers of the brain. So when we see spiritual understanding in the neocortex and understand why the unpleasant things that have happened to us occur, the evolutionary value they have, and the purpose of love they have behind them, that cleanses our traumas, right? Without us realizing it. Why does the higher vibration start acting on the lower one and clean it without us realizing, right? Just to give an example, I've mentioned once with Pablo, and that we both like, I think, which is if tomorrow someone comes with a bag full of confetti, right? And if you prick it and it falls to the ground, of course, we can kneel down and pick up the confetti one by one, right? But it takes us 2 hours and we wear ourselves out, right? It's much better to use the vacuum cleaner. That's why they were invented, right? So therefore, the vacuum cleaner for our traumas is the spiritual understanding we develop in our conscious mind. And if that is deep enough, it cleans us without realizing of all unconscious traumas. And we can avoid psychoanalysis and whatnot, because psychoanalysis is like picking up confetti one by one. It's searching for traumas one by one. When we find those traumas, we also inadvertently re-energize them, right? And although it can give good results, it is slow and costly, as all of us who have done it know. Now, if we bring the vacuum cleaner, everything goes up, and that's it. You understand? So spiritual understanding is the vacuum cleaner for unconscious trauma, right? Therefore, if we want to get rid of any unconscious traumas we might have, it's much more useful to use spiritual understanding than psychoanalysis, okay? And it's faster and less energy consuming. And one day we wake up and we have no trauma left. Of course, we understand that everything that has happened to us is created by God for the growth of our soul, with a purpose of love, that we had to go through these experiences for one reason or another, because He does not make mistakes, and then there is no possible trauma. Am I making myself clear? So that's an idea I throw out to you and leave with you, right? And now finally, there are no problems in the world, only problems in our mind, and that is where we have to solve them. And when we have a clear mind, we will have reached the famous 3 zeros and 2 hundreds that I like so much, right? Which is 0 suffering, 0 resistance, and 0 reactivity, all right, to the external. And the 200s, 100% spiritual understanding and 100% service attitude. And when we achieve those 3 zeros and those 2 hundreds, we have graduated, and then we will move on to the university, each as they wish to conceive. But we will no longer suffer, and we will not have to learn more in the third dimension. Well, I have used, I think, the time that we have allocated, and if it seems fine to you, we can move on to the question session that Juan wants to ask or select. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. As always, a pleasure to listen to you. There are some questions. There are some questions about this topic of the mind. That what are they? There's one from Esther Martin, who asked if it could happen that in order to feel at peace, we end up manipulating our own thoughts.
I hope so. There are good and bad manipulations, right? I mean, if by manipulating it means that I won't let harmful thoughts stay in my mind, or I will change them for more positive or spiritual ones, then blessed be that manipulation. Do I make myself clear? Of course, keep in mind that we direct our thoughts unless we become subject to them, right? For example, I'm sitting here now, and I can become a witness to my thought and say, I don't allow myself to continue thinking in this direction. It's over. Am I clear? I mean, am I manipulating? No. I am directing my thoughts to thoughts of love, spirituality, of you understand, of peace. And that is positive manipulation, not negative. Do I make myself clear? I mean, don't be afraid to manipulate your own mind, because manipulating the mind would be bad if we manipulated it downward, right? But if we manipulate it upward, then blessed be manipulation, as I said, right? Unless I misunderstood the question, right? Well, that would be my answer.
Let's go with another one. Gonzalo, thank you very much. Antoliano Silvero asks or says that it goes like this. It says, is creation a thought of the creator? Well, if so, are we the means through which he becomes aware of his own thoughts?
Well, let's see. No, it's true that many mystics and even many philosophers have claimed that creation is the thought of God, right? And well, I couldn't assure it 100% because I can't get into the mind of God, right? But I can say that it is let's say it is an idea very frequently used by many thinkers and some mystics that I have read, right? It can have a certain logic. And I can't say it's false at all, but I can't say it's 100% correct either, right? It's just that sometimes look, I think it's better for us to try to understand the house of how God has done things, the whys, right? Because to understand why God has done this or God has done that, we need to know God and get into God's mind, right? And at our evolutionary level, it's not possible, right? What is possible for us is it's about getting to know a little more each time how things have been done. Well, we know that water is made up of being H2O, right? 2 molecules of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen that come together and such. Well, now we know how, right? Now, why God has done what he has done? There are those who say that God created the creation to know himself, because by seeing what he is not, he better understands what he is, right? Others say that creation is the thought of God, and that seems possibly correct to me, but I cannot be sure that it might be that, or at least that it is only that, right? But it could also have been an act of generosity, which is trying to create other gods, right? Through his ascending children, right? I mean, there are many explanations for this, and I wouldn't know. I can only say that that question and that explanation this person gives has been used on more than one occasion in books of philosophy or spirituality, but I cannot go further.
Chrysostomo says, sometimes we say, you have guessed my thoughts. And it continues, can our thoughts connect with those of other people to help them?
No doubt. Look, one of the things that quantum physics has demonstrated is what's called quantum entanglement. In English, it's called entanglement, right? This literally means also there are many television programs you can even search for on YouTube and enter the word. That's right, isn't it? The quantum entanglement or entanglement in English, and they explain it perfectly, don't they? Notice that if an electron comes into contact with another electron, even if you take this electron, this second electron to the other end of the universe, as soon as this electron changes polarity, this one does the same instantly. Notice that many times we are thinking about a person, boom, and they call us on the phone in that instant. Maybe we haven't talked to her for 3 months, right? So there is an entanglement of like-minded minds, right? You know what I mean? And so, of course, that mental connection exists. Moreover, in the future, when we are more evolved, we will not use cell phones to communicate. We will do it through telepathy, right? So there is indeed a connection between minds. And it has an explanation, not only mental or spiritual, but physical, right? Which is the entanglement of quantum particles. Of course, since both the mind and the brain are made up of quantum particles, it's normal for entanglement to occur at both levels, right? So the answer is yes.
Alejandra asks and says, the topic of Ho'oponopono, of I'm sorry, forgive me, thank you, I love you, does it really help to cleanse?
Without a doubt. Look, everything, Ho'oponopono, as you know, is a Hawaiian philosophy that developed in Hawaii, and, well, is a spiritual philosophy like other philosophies, right? And everything that is, that we talked about deep forgiveness, right? In the previous conference on self-responsibility versus victimhood, no? I mean, anything that involves using higher spiritual principles helps to clear the mind, of course, because it raises the vibration, and that higher vibrational energy cleans, without us consciously realizing it, the stagnant energies of lower vibration. Therefore, any understanding or advanced or true spiritual philosophy helps in cleansing the mind, without a doubt. And Ho'oponopono, well, it is correct, and in my opinion, it is useful. But what Ho'oponopono says is not only said by Ho'oponopono, it is also stated by other spiritual traditions, right? So it is common to other philosophies as well.
Here is another question from Gonzalo. I understand that mystical consciousness is non-dual. Yes, and it continues. In this state of consciousness, is there thought?
No, there is no thought. What there is a direct apprehension of information, which we then interpret with thought. What we then use thought for is to be able to explain it to others. But the mystical experience is by definition transcendental. I mean, above thought, it is intuitive, okay? It is not sequential. And also, as we said in the conference of the mystical consciousness, of the blocks of consciousness, which I think was the third or fourth, I don't remember now, right? Not only is it transcendental, but it also cannot be controlled by thought. If we have thought, there is no mystical experience. It's a bit, the example I gave, if you remember, is a bit like when we dream at night, we don't control the dream. If we interpret it when we wake up in the morning, right, and we move to another type of consciousness, right? To the consciousness of the self. That is why many wise people have said that the best service one can do for others is to make the ineffable understandable, right? But to turn the ineffable into comprehensible, we do use the mind because we have to communicate it in concepts, right? But in itself, mystical consciousness is transmental. Therefore, it is not conceptual.
Turn the ineffable into something understandable.
Yes, that is a great service. Very difficult to do, right? Because of course, the mystical experience is ineffable. I mean, you can't explain it with ordinary language or with the tools of thought. Think the usual concepts. Keep in mind that language has limitations, right? And language is limited to the consciousness of the self, isn't it? Clearly, the mystical experience is above the mind, above language, and above everything. And explaining that from language and concepts is not an easy task. Many mystics have expressed this difficulty, right? It's not just me saying it, right?
Gabi asks, Gonzalo, is the mind the biblical original sin?
No. Let's see. Yes, I'd rather not get into original sin because I believe that original sin, with all due respect to whoever conceived it that way, is not how the matter occurred, right? Because you'll see, as far as I understand it, original sin would mean that Adam and Eve were in wisdom, okay? So for committing a mistake or a sin, they fell into ignorance, and from there we've had to evolve again. But evolution doesn't go from wisdom to ignorance and back to wisdom. Rather, it happens from innocence, passing through ignorance to reach wisdom, right? So for me, and I could be wrong, and with all respect to those who think differently, original sin has to be understood in another way, right? Then, in any case, the ego, not just the mind, the ego, right, would be the ignorance that we have to overcome, right? So for that, God has created the ego. The ego is an evolutionary instrument that we have, right? So I think that humans start in innocence, absence of information. We develop the ego to go through levels of ignorance that by transcending it, lead us to wisdom. That's what I think, right? So we shouldn't confuse original sin with the mind. In any case, it would be with the entire ego. If we believed in original sin, well, we would say that the ego is the consequence, wouldn't we, of having committed the original sin and then having to transcend it. But personally, and with all the respect in the world, and with all humility, and please, of course, without scandalizing anyone, I think the original sin has been misinterpreted.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. A couple more questions. What do you think?
Oh, of course, as many as you want. The limitation is your time, not mine. I'm happy to help in any way I can.
Very well, Gonzalo. So look, Ivan from Tarragona asks or says, is intuition prophecy?
No, not necessarily. Intuition is direct apprehension of the truth. Prophecy, as far as I understand it, is because this can also be a semantic issue, right? So, well, prophecy is when we can somehow foresee future things in some way, right? And that can be part of intuition, but not all intuition is prophecy, right? I mean, we can have intuition about many things, right? That are not prophetic, but are other understandings. I don't know if I'm explaining myself right, direct about other subjects. Prophecy, well, it's people who have the psychic ability to see the future, so to speak, right? If I understand it like that, right? The word prophecy Maybe I misunderstand the word prophecy and then I answer the question incorrectly, right? But as I understand prophecy, it's that to prophesize, right? What might happen or what is going to happen or how, right? So I think intuition is broader than prophecy, let's say.
And Dave Arreche says, are thoughts being implanted in our intuition?
No. Let's see. Information is being implanted in our intuition, but not in the form of thought, because otherwise what they would be planting in us are thoughts, right? Which are also planted. But intuition isn't conceptual, is it? And therefore, I think with intuit, it's a very good question, but I think information is planted in us through intuition. Another thing is that on other occasions, they might also plant thoughts, right? But notice that a planted thought is sequential, isn't it? And intuition is not sequential.
Very well, Gonzalo. One last question, which is actually two. They are two questions. I'm going to join them, right? Laura Cabrera asks if the disorders, asks about mental and affective disorders. They belong to the extract cerebral in mental, and ask where the consciousness of those who suffer from it remains. And Esther says, I would be interested in adding to Laura's question the case of people with mental disabilities.
All right, let's start with the second question. People with mental disabilities have in some way a damaged anchor, okay? The brain is the anchor. So if tomorrow I damage my brain, for example, because I've had a stroke, or well, the anchor is spoiled, right? And when the anchor is spoiled, right, the ability to reason or to use an abstract reference gets spoiled. It's affected, right? Because it has been left. For example, a child with Down syndrome that dies at the age of 1. Obviously, he will not undergo spiritual growth, but all those around him will. That's why souls sometimes volunteer for that, right? Because later they will receive the reward, right? But many times, keep in mind that the evolution of the soul is both individual and collective at the same time, as we have said. I am sure that all our souls at some point volunteer as part of the evolutionary process to be more of a help to others than to ourselves. That will already be rewarded 100-fold, as the gospel says, but I believe it happens. There can also be different mental disorders. That is to say, I don't have damage to the organ, so to speak, but I have a mental disorder because, as we said before, we have allowed negative, obsessive thoughts, to nest in our head. And that has created mental and emotional disorders for us, right? It's no longer so much about having a damaged organ, the anchor, but rather the mind, how we use our mind, right? That's why I think, for example, when you have brain damage, right? I mean, damage to the anchor, it's a good idea to go to a psychiatrist. They'll be able to see whether, hey, it can be treated or not, if the neurons are. Now, if what you have are mental or emotional disorders, not because the anchor is damaged, right? But because you haven't used your thinking well or haven't managed your emotions properly, well, the one who's best suited to help you with that is a good spiritual director, right? Even more than a psychologist or a psychiatrist, right? So there are mental disorders due to the anchoring that is due to the deterioration of the organ, right? For example, a person who has Alzheimer's, you can take them to all the spiritual directors you want, they just can't. You know what I mean? Because the organ is damaged. Now, there are mental and emotional disorders that occur without having damage to the organ, because we haven't managed ourselves well emotionally, sentimentally, or mentally. We must distinguish between these two different types of disorder. One can be overcome by changing our way of thinking, by increasing our spiritual understanding. But a person with Alzheimer's has their anchorage completely damaged and can no longer progress to the next stage. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, right? Now they can teach a lot to those around them, that they have to take care of them, that they have to, okay? If not, God would take them up already because their course is finished unless they have to teach others, okay?
Thank you very much, Gonzalo.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for all your answers and for all your words. Well, I think we can end today's session here. Next time, Gonzalo will talk to us about human relationships from love or from ego.
Yes.
And well, we invite you all to join us next Thursday to see each other here again.
Well, thank you all very much. It's really a pleasure. And I just hope this can help in some way, okay? But thank you very much and see you next Thursday, okay?
See you next Thursday, Gonzalo. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all.